Now, footballers, despite, I'm afraid, despite the fact that there are many football fans here perhaps, footballers' contribution to wealth and development and progress, no, nothing like zero virtually. But footballers were, sports people were the first ones to be granted this incredible possibility to be virtually globally mobile, which is not the case for you. And I don't point at you because you may not be from an EU member state, so this fortress Europe, so to speak, beneficiaries. Despite all the efforts you do people provide, we currently are waging war against the very institutions which provided, through the freedom, liberty, the freedom to move around, the freedom to create wealth, that is to have a properly economic activity. We're waging war at those institutions for reasons which are, as Rasen Stančić pointed out, basically barriers to entry on the market. We're waging, because we cannot say we're waging war on the free market, as the free market generates a lot of wealth. It's a very hidden war against the institutions which would support the free market. And the easiest way to wage this war is to point out the differences. You're Armenian, you're from Georgia, or you're Chinese. You don't belong to our community, and we fall back into a tribal world, which I'm afraid becomes extremely powerful because it creates layers in our perceptions of what society shall be. We fall back in a tribal world where all faults are not with us, but with the different people, with the differences we may no longer accept because they challenge our own understanding of how great and good and correct we are. A very quick reminder for economic students, and I'll let the floor, I think I have enough time, is Daniel Bernoulli, if you've heard the name, is an Italian mathematician who 3 centuries or something, approximately three and a half centuries ago, came up with the idea of basically what became marginal utility. The idea that utility decreases with the increase in quantity of given we possess. And surprisingly, he didn't come with this idea. He didn't come up with this idea in a very fertile environment like Italy, northern Italy, or France, or back then in time, before it became a welfare state, or in London. He came up with this idea in Russia, where a number of scientists from Europe were invited in order to contribute to scientific development in the Russian state, in the Russian country, so for the Russian people. The acknowledgement of the value of human resource and human capital has been present for a very, very long time. And a student of mine has tried to challenge me, and it is challenging, with the question if the state shall hire foreigners and even for sensitive positions. And the answer, of course, to this question will be yes. We have to make up our mind to the fact that nationality is not a criteria when it comes to the best possible use of human resources, which is the scarcest resource we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kuzanov. We're going to proceed to our third speaker. His name is Donny Schwartz. He's currently a professor of philosophy here at AUBG, teaching business ethics, and I hope he'll provide us with slightly shifted perspective from economic migration.
hear me, can you?
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay, I guess it's working. Okay. So yes, I'm going to have more of a moral argument here. My view is that immigration should be basically open. That unless someone coming into a country is an objective physical threat, they have a moral right to be allowed in, and people who want to deal with them, whether employers or anyone else, have a right to allow them onto their property, into their businesses, and to work for them. I'm a fan of writing.
I do hear you very well.
Okay. I'm a fan of writing fiction, so I want to argue for this through a story. It's working now, right? So let's imagine a guy named Alex. He's a business owner. I'm just going to say, it doesn't matter what kind of business it is. It's a widget factory. And Alex has 5 employees. Just give them names: Boris, Carl, Doris, Elizabeth, and Fred. Let's imagine, sorry, Boris. Let's imagine Boris and Carl are lazy. So they make 2 widgets per day, when a hardworking person should be able to make 6 widgets per day. Doris's favorite thing about her job is the workplace culture, specifically the fact that everyone goes to the same church. And Elizabeth and Fred are highly paid, because they were hired when the widget business was booming, but the business is not booming now. And so Alex, the owner, wonders whether he could revive his struggling business by replacing the lazy employees, that was Boris and Carl, or by finding someone who will accept a lower salary. So he posts a job ad, hoping to hire anyone who can help his business get back on track. Okay, so Boris, Carl, Doris, Elizabeth, and Fred, they're afraid, they're upset when they discover the job ad. Boris and Carl fear that there are harder, more desperate workers out there. Doris feels secure about her job, but she's learned that some of the people being interviewed have Arabic names, and she's worried about the effect they could have on that culture of the business she likes. Elizabeth and Fred, the highly paid ones, they're concerned they'll need to accept a lower salary to remain competitive. So Boris, Carl, Doris, Elizabeth, and Fred agree they must take action. They hire some security guards to watch the entrance to the building, and every time someone comes in for a job interview, they instruct the guards to kidnap the applicant and to release them only when they agree to stay away and not to come back until they're invited. If they're lucky, the guards are instructed to say to the applicants, then maybe every once in a while, the current employees will feel generous enough to allow an applicant in. That's kidnapping. Kidnapping, of course, is illegal, but what's evil about this, I think, is not just a matter of its being illegal. It's wrong because it's an unjustified initiation of force against innocent people who are just pursuing a better life for themselves. Even if these 5 employees managed to legalize this initiation of force, the evil would remain. And the legalized use of force at a nation's border is no less unjust. All it means is that there are hundreds of thousands of Carls and hundreds of thousands of Freds who have managed to legalize the initiation of force against innocent people pursuing a better life for themselves. For them to band together and to use the power of the state to prevent immigration is a violation of rights of the migrant to move freely onto a willing individual's land, and it's a violation of the rights of that willing individual who wants to welcome the migrant, in this case, rights of the business owner who wants to employ the migrant. So that's my analogy and my argument for open immigration. That doesn't mean that there should be no border or no screening at the border. So it's wrong to initiate force against harmless innocents, but the role of the government is to protect citizens from domestic and foreign threats and to use force, if necessary, but only as a response to real, objective, physical threats. So, if there's evidence that infectious disease is a concern, then it's legitimate to screen the migrants to prevent their doing harm to the population through their transmission of infectious disease. If there's evidence that a person is a criminal or a terrorist, it's legitimate to exclude them. But there has to be evidence. I think one is innocent, should be considered innocent until proven guilty. And that includes people coming from across the border. If there is a declared war against some country, then it's legitimate to exclude people coming from the country you're at war with, if there's a threat from that country. Okay, so that's the kind of screening I think is legitimate, but otherwise I think people are innocent until proven guilty. Now, those who argue that immigrants can pose a threat by seeking radical changes to the laws, I think this is a real concern sometimes if you have people from countries with very different legal traditions. Those who argue that immigrants can pose a threat that way would have a point if it were easy for immigrants to become citizens with full voting rights. But my view is that immigration should be very easy, but becoming a citizen who can participate in the government, that should be hard. Immigrants should have to assimilate before becoming citizens with that right to participate in the government. And in practice, I think immigrants do assimilate for 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and then eventually it's good to have them be participants in that system. Now, suppose they don't assimilate to some extent. What about our cultural traditions? What about all the change that's going to happen and we're going to lose? We're going to have people with different religions and different dances. What about our culture? Well, if our first point, if our culture is really worth preserving, we should be prepared to communicate its appeal to newcomers and to encourage them to assimilate. If cultural traditions can only be preserved by forcibly keeping people out, what does that say about the value of our cultural traditions? I don't know, American culture has spread around the world, presumably because people see the value in that culture. And if culture really were valuable, immigrants would come and you could persuade them, hey, this is a culture you want to adopt aspects of for yourself. Second, we have this metaphor of a melting pot in the United States, or some people have the metaphor of a salad bowl, which are ways of saying that diversity of culture and traditions is of value for a lot of people. Whether it's having all different sorts of ethnic foods around, or different forms of entertainment, different dances, different maybe even religions or rituals. That can be a value that can benefit those of us who are willing to experiment with those things and be a little adventurous. But if you don't want those things, if you don't want to be adventurous and explore new foods or new religions, no one can force you to adopt those things. If you don't like these new religions, then don't adopt them. Okay, so the immigrants coming does not force you to be exposed to their culture if you don't want to be exposed. Some people have defended restrictive immigration policies on the grounds that a nation's bound by a social contract. So I want to deal with that idea. And on one understanding of social contract theory, society is a little like a club, like a book club or something like that. In order to be a part of the club, you have to agree to abide by certain rules. Okay. Furthermore, a club has no obligation, and this would be how the argument goes against me, a club has no obligation to accept new members, and it's not an initiation of force. It's not like, kidnapping someone if the book club says, our group's already too large, we don't want new members. And so, how do I respond to that? Well, I don't think that's the right way to understand the kind of social contract that's the basis for a just society. A nation is not like a club. For one thing, we're not born into clubs, but we're born into whatever country we're born into. Also, clubs have to be defined to a particular physical location. When they're meeting in a house or in a library. They don't occupy a whole territory. Also, while we can get certain privileges by being a part of a club, and some people want certain privileges, like being protected from outside competition for their job by being part of a country, the difference is that the right to life, liberty, including the freedom of movement, the right to the pursuit of happiness, those are not like membership privileges in a club. Those are things we have just by virtue of being human beings, in my view. So I agree on the social contract theory with John Locke's version of a social contract. Even without a government, we each have a right to defend ourselves from thieves, murderers, other threats. And then when we form a government, it's that right of self-defense, basically. It's the right to administer justice that we give up so that we can have a more objective government administer justice for us all. That's all we give up. We can't give up to the government any rights which were not our rights to begin with. If we have no right to detain innocent people without a government, if we can't go out and kidnap people, then that right is not something we can give up to the government to do for us. Ultimately, the value of rights lies in the fact that they make human flourishing and peaceful cooperation and harmony possible. Freedom for both migrants and employers in this case means the freedom to do their best to try to figure out how to live a better life for themselves. For the employee, prospective employee, that means how they can have the freedom to figure out how to make a living off their talents and abilities and travel if need be to do that. For the employer, that means they have the freedom to figure out how they can make their business flourish. And that's, I think, why these rights in practice work out when you respect them. It allows for peaceful, productive cooperation and for a flourishing society. So if you condemn, in my story, if you condemn Boris, if you condemn Carl, and you condemn those others for interfering with that freedom, then you should also be an advocate for more open borders.